Chapter 1. The biting northern wind was a poor welcome. It whipped through the gaps in the rough wooden cage I shared with a dozen other terrified captives, stealing what little warmth remained in my thin tunic. Just days ago, I was Eliza, assistant to the village healer back south, my biggest worry whether the feverfew harvest would be enough. Now I was cargo, human chattel, dragged across the border after raiders attacked our village. I hadn't thought for myself. I'd tried to shield old Maeve, our healer, from a raider's grabbing hands. Maeve had escaped into the woods, but my defiance had earned me ropes in this cage. Our journey ended at the foot of Black Fang Peak, a jagged scar of rock against a perpetually gray sky. At its summit perched a fortress of dark, unforgiving stone, looking less like a home and more like a wound on the mountainside. This was Frostfang Keep, seat of King Theron, the vicious Lycan King. Even the raiders who'd captured us spoke his name in hushed, fearful tones. They herded us like cattle through massive iron gates and into a bleak, wind-swept courtyard. The air inside the fortress walls was thick with tension and the sharp, musky scent of wolf. Lycans in rough leather and furs moved with a disciplined, predatory grace, their eyes cold and assessing as they looked us over. There's no chatter, no warmth, just a heavy, watchful silence that screamed of danger. This was a place ruled by fear. We were shoved into a holding cell, the iron door slamming shut with a sound like a guillotine. Hours later, a stern-faced Lycan woman with eyes like chips of ice came for me. "The king requires a new scullery maid," she announced, her voice flat. "You look strong enough. Come." Strong enough? I felt like a brittle twig about to snap. She led me through echoing stone corridors, her pace brisk and her silence absolute. We arrived at the entrance to what looked like a great hall. Music, heavy and somber, drifted out. Before I could process anything, the woman shoved me forward. "Take this tray in. Announce the wine. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look directly at the king. Do not drop anything." I stumbled, touching the heavy silver tray laden with goblets just before it fell. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was supposed to serve these predators? On trembling legs, I pushed open the massive doors and stepped into the king's hall. Hundreds of eyes turned towards me, cold and unwelcoming. And on a throne of black stone at the far end sat the king himself, a figure of terrifying, scarred majesty.
Chapter 2. The Great Hall was vast and imposing, built for giants and kings, not trembling human servants. Dark banners depicting snarling wolves hung from the high stone walls, absorbing the flickering torchlight and deepening the shadows. Dozens of Lycans sat at long, heavy wooden tables, their faces grim, their eyes tracking my every clumsy step. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, pine resin, and the underlying potent musk of predator. There was no laughter, no easy conversation, just a low, tense murmur and the clatter of heavy goblets on wood. My hands shook, making the silver goblets on the tray rattle precariously. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor, just as the stern woman had instructed. Do not look at the king. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not drop anything. The simple rules felt like navigating a minefield. The floor seemed miles long. Finally, I reached the foot of the dais where the king sat. He was even more terrifying up close. A massive figure slumped slightly in his black stone throne, radiating an aura of barely contained violence. Scars, old and white, marked his face. One jagged line cut through his eyebrow, another traced the hard line of his jaw. His dark hair was shaggy, falling over a brow furrowed in a perpetual scowl. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on some distant point, lost in thoughts that were clearly dark and dangerous. I managed to place a goblet near one of the seated lords, my hands slick with nervous sweat. As I reached to place the next one, my foot caught on the edge of a thick wolf pelt rug. I stumbled, the heavy tray tilting violently. Goblet slid, wine sloshed. A collective intake of breath hissed through the hall. By some miracle, I managed to regain my balance, catching the tray just before its contents spilled across the stone floor. But in that frantic, clumsy recovery, I broke the cardinal rule. My head snapped up and my terrified gaze collided directly with the king's. His eyes weren't gold like Alexander's. They were the color of ice, a pale, chilling blue that seemed to pierce right through me. For a split second, I saw surprise flicker in their depths, quickly followed by a flash of pure Arctic fury. A low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the floor and up my spine, freezing me in place. The entire hall held its breath. "How dare you?" King Theron roared, his voice a crack of thunder that bounced off the stone walls. His hand slammed down on the arm of his throne, the sound echoing the violent beat of my own heart. He didn't specify what that was, the stumble, the near spill, or the unforgivable act of meeting his gaze. It didn't matter. The threat was absolute. I had made my first mistake, and somehow I knew it wouldn't be my last.
Chapter 3. The king's roar echoed in the sudden, absolute silence of the hall. I stood frozen, the heavy tray still clutched in my trembling hands, his icy blue eyes pinning me in place. Terror, cold and sharp, washed over me. I had broken the rules within minutes of arriving. What happened now? Would he have me dragged out and flogged? Killed? His reputation suggested the worst. But he didn't move. He simply stared at me, his expression a mask of cold fury, the growl still vibrating low in his chest. The moment stretched, thick with dread. Finally, a stern-faced beta seated near the throne cleared his throat. "Continue serving, girl," he commanded, his voice sharp but lacking the king's sheer menace. "And keep your eyes on the floor, where they belong." It was a dismissal. Not from the king, but from his court. Shakily, I lowered my gaze, focusing on the rough stone floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a painful reminder of my near disaster. I forced my trembling hands to move, carefully placing the remaining goblets on the table. Every lichen I passed seemed to radiate a cold hostility. I was the clumsy human who had drawn the king's wrath, disrupting their solemn gathering. Once the tray was empty, I practically fled the great hall, my cheeks burning with shame and fear. The stern woman who had sent me in was waiting just outside the doors, her arms crossed, her expression glacial. "Idiot girl," she hissed, grabbing my arm in a bruising grip. "You were told the rules. One mistake was nearly your last. Follow me." She dragged me away from the grand hall and down a series of narrow, winding back stairs, descending into the belly of the fortress. The air grew colder, damper, smelling of stored root vegetables, harsh soap, and unwashed bodies. This was the servants' domain. We arrived in a vast, steamy kitchen, a chaotic hive of activity. Hulking lichens, both male and female, moved with rough efficiency, chopping meat, scrubbing massive pots, tending fires under bubbling cauldrons. The noise was deafening, a stark contrast to the tense silence of the hall above. The woman shoved me towards a towering pile of dirty pots and pans. "You start here, and you will work until I say you can stop. No mistakes, no clumsiness. Around here, mistakes earn you more than a shout." She gave me one last contemptuous look before stalking away. I stared at the mountain of greasy, scorched metal. This was my new reality. Endless, back-breaking labor under the constant threat of violence. It wasn't the death sentence I had feared, but it was its own kind of hell. At least here, maybe I wouldn't have to face the king with the terrifying ice blue eyes again.
Chapter 4. The kitchens were a brutal, hierarchical world unto themselves. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of scrubbing, chopping, hauling, and enduring the casual cruelty of the Lycan staff. They worked with a focused, almost silent intensity, their movements efficient and often rough. There was no camaraderie, no shared smiles or complaints. Each wolf seemed locked in their own struggle for survival, eager to prove their worth and avoid the sharp tongue or heavy hand of the kitchen overseer, a burly male named Groll with a perpetually foul temper. My human clumsiness was a constant source of friction. I moved too slowly. I didn't anticipate needs with the same preternatural instinct. I occasionally dropped things, a potato here, a ladle there, earning snarls and cuffs from Groll or contemptuous glares from the others. They saw me as weak, incompetent, a burden. My silence, born of fear and the desire to remain invisible, only seemed to irritate them further. One afternoon, a young, skittish Omega wolf, barely more than a boy, dropped a heavy sack of grain, spilling its contents across the dusty floor. Groll roared, advancing on the trembling Omega with his fist raised. Without thinking, I stepped forward. "It was my fault," I said, quickly, my voice small but clear. "I bumped into him." It was a lie, a stupid, impulsive act of empathy in a place where such things were dangerous. Groll stopped, turning his furious gaze on me. The Omega stared at me, his eyes wide with shock and terror, clearly expecting me to be punished severely for my interference. Groll looked me up and down, his lip curling. Perhaps striking the king's newly acquired, albeit lowly, servant was a risk he wasn't willing to take just yet. "Clean it up, Stray. Both of you. And if you interfere again, I'll see you cleaning the kennels with your tongue." The Omega shot me a look of terrified gratitude before scrambling to help me gather the spilled grain. It was a small victory, but it cemented my status as an outsider. I didn't play by their rules. I didn't understand that here, you looked out only for yourself. Later that evening, while emptying slop buckets out back, I heard the king's voice from an upper window, sharp and commanding, berating someone within. The raw, controlled fury in his tone sent a shiver down my spine, a potent reminder of the beast whose hall I had offended. Even the kitchen stuff, hardened as they were, seemed to walk a little softer, speak a little quieter when the king was near. He was a constant, terrifying presence, even when unseen. I finished my task quickly, eager to retreat back into the relative anonymity of the scullery, my small act of defiance forgotten in the face of the king's ever-present shadow.
Chapter 5. The kitchens remained my world, a place of scalding steam, sharp knives, and simmering resentment. I learned quickly to keep my head down and my mouth shut, focusing on the endless tasks. The small act of defending the Omega boy had earned me Groll's increased scrutiny and the wary distance of the other servants. They didn't understand why I'd risk my own skin for someone else, especially an Omega. It simply wasn't the Lycan way, not in this harsh northern court. Survival here meant looking out for number one. Empathy was a liability. My clumsiness, however, seemed ingrained. One evening, while rushing to carry a heavy cauldron of stew away from the fire, I misjudged the distance to a stack of firewood. I stumbled, the hot, thick stew sloshing dangerously close to the edge. I managed to save it, but not before bumping hard against the woodpile, sending several logs clattering loudly across the stone floor. Every wolf in the kitchen froze, their heads snapping towards the noise. Groll's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. Before he could unleash his fury,
A low, quiet voice cut through the sudden silence from the kitchen doorway. "Is there a problem here?" It was the king. Theron stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe, his icy blue eyes sweeping over the scene. He wasn't dressed in regal attire, but in simple black leathers, as if he had just come from training. His presence instantly sucked the air out of the room. Grohl, who had been about to roar at me, immediately bowed his head, his face pale. "No, Your Majesty, just a minor accident. The human—" Theron's gaze shifted to me. I stood frozen, clutching the heavy cauldron, my heart pounding. I expected the same fury I'd seen in the Great Hall, the same terrifying roar. Instead, his expression was unreadable, almost bored. His eyes flickered to the spilled logs, then back to my face, lingering there for a beat longer than necessary. Was that a flicker of amusement in those icy depths, or just contempt? "See that it doesn't happen again," Theron said, his voice flat, before turning and disappearing back into the corridor as silently as he had arrived. The collective breath the kitchen staff had been holding whooshed out. Grohl shot me a look that promised retribution later, but the king's unexpected, almost dismissive intervention had saved me for now. As I knelt to gather the fallen logs, my hands trembling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the king hadn't just happened by. He had been watching. And his reaction, or lack thereof, was more confusing and unsettling than any outright anger could have been. The vicious Lycan King was proving to be dangerously unpredictable.
Chapter 6. Life settled back into its harsh rhythm, but something had shifted. The king's strange, almost non-reaction to my clumsiness became a topic of hushed, fearful whispers among the kitchen staff. No one understood it. Theron was known for his explosive temper, especially towards perceived incompetence. His quiet dismissal felt more ominous than a roar. Was he playing some kind of game? Was he simply biding his time before unleashing a truly terrifying punishment? I tried to be more careful, more invisible than ever. I focused on my work, scrubbing pots until my fingers were raw, chopping vegetables until my arms ached, hauling heavy buckets until my back screamed. But the fortress, which had seemed vast and impersonal, began to feel smaller, claustrophobic. It was as if the king's presence, even when unseen, permeated every stone. I started seeing him more often. Perhaps I was just more aware of him. Glances caught in corridors as I scurried past with laundry. His imposing figure standing silently on a balcony overlooking the training grounds, where I sometimes hung linens to dry. He never spoke to me. He rarely even looked directly at me. But I felt his gaze, a weight on my skin, an unnerving awareness that sent shivers down my spine. One evening, I was tasked with polishing the silver in a small, rarely used sitting room adjacent to the king's private library. The room was cold, dust motes dancing in the single beam of moonlight slanting through a high window. I worked quickly, my rag moving rhythmically over a tarnished candelabra, eager to finish and escape back to the relative anonymity of the kitchens. Suddenly, the door to the library creaked open. My heart leapt into my throat. Theron stood there, holding a heavy, leather-bound book. He stopped dead when he saw me, surprise flickering briefly in his icy blue eyes before being replaced by his usual guarded mask. We stared at each other for a long, silent moment, the only sound the frantic pounding of my own heart. He was the king, I was a scullery maid. I should have dropped my gaze, bowed my head, and made myself invisible. But I couldn't. His unexpected presence, the sudden intimacy of the quiet moonlit room, held me. I met his stare directly, my own fear warring with a strange, defiant spark. It was the same mistake I had made in the Great Hall. I braced myself for the inevitable roar, the furious command. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, a gesture of almost animalistic curiosity, his gaze intense, searching. "You," he said, his voice a low, rough sound that vibrated in the stillness. "What are you doing in here?"
Chapter 7. My breath hitched, caught, again. And I had done it again, looked him directly in the eye. The king, the beast whose roar could shake the fortress walls. I waited for the explosion, the furious dismissal, the call for guards. My knuckles were white where I gripped the polishing rag. I was assigned to polish the silver, Your Majesty, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I forced myself to drop my gaze to the floor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I did not know anyone used this room. I apologize if I disturbed you. Silence. Thick, heavy, and terrifying. I could feel his icy blue eyes fixed on me, dissecting my fear, my clumsy explanation. Why wasn't he shouting? Why wasn't he calling for Grohl to drag me away? The waiting was almost worse than the expected punishment. I risked a tiny glance upwards through my lashes. He hadn't moved. He still stood in the library doorway, the heavy book held loosely in one hand, his expression an unreadable mask of cold contemplation. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, the soft thud of his boot on the rug echoing in the stillness. "Look at me," he commanded. The order was quiet, almost conversational, yet it held the unshakable weight of absolute authority. My head snapped up automatically, my eyes meeting his before I could stop myself. Terror warred with a spark of defiance. This was the third time I had broken the most fundamental rule of his court. He stared at me, his gaze intense, searching. A low growl rumbled in his chest, the same sound I'd heard in the great hall, the precursor to his rage. I flinched, bracing myself. "That is twice now, human. Twice you have challenged my authority with your eyes. Are you deaf to the laws of this court or simply suicidal?" He took another step closer, closing the distance until only a few feet separated us. His sheer size, his barely contained power was overwhelming in the small, quiet room. I forget," I whispered, honestly, cursing my own stupid human instincts. "Where I come from, looking away is considered disrespectful, shifty." A flicker of surprise crossed his harsh features. He hadn't expected that answer. He clearly expected fear, pleas, or utter submission. My simple, honest explanation had caught him off guard. The growl in his chest subsided slightly, replaced by that same unnerving, analytical curiosity. He tilted his head, studying me as if I were a strange, unknown species. "Disrespectful," he repeated softly, testing the word. "An interesting perspective." He didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded intrigued, and that somehow felt even more dangerous.
Chapter 8. The word interesting hung in the quiet, moonlit room. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot, but it wasn't the roar of fury I had braced myself for either. King Theron continued to study me, his icy blue eyes narrowed in thought, as if my simple explanation had presented him with a puzzle he couldn't immediately solve. The concept that direct eye contact could be anything other than a challenge seemed genuinely foreign to him. "So," he said finally, his voice still low but losing some of its dangerous edge, "in your world, avoiding a man's gaze implies dishonesty? Or fear?" I replied softly, emboldened slightly by his lack of immediate violence. "Or submission? It depends on the context. But directness, it usually means honesty, respect even." He made a low sound in his throat, not quite a growl, more like a thoughtful hum. A strange custom. Here, only a fool or an equal meets the alpha's eyes. It is a challenge, a declaration. He paused, his gaze sweeping over my small, clearly unequal form. You are neither. I'm just clumsy, I offered weakly, gesturing vaguely with the polishing rags still clutched in my hand. And forgetful. I don't mean any challenge, Your Majesty, truly. He ignored my assurances, his focus snagged on something else. His eyes flickered down to the tarnished silver candelabra I had been working on, then back to my hands. You were cleaning this? Yes, Your Majesty. As ordered. He stepped closer, reaching out, not for me, but for the candelabra. He picked it up, turning it over in his large hands, examining the intricate, tarnished details. This belonged to my mother, he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, tinged with a distant, unexpected note of melancholy. She favored this room. Few use it now. The admission was a tiny crack in his icy facade, a glimpse of a past, a hint of emotion beyond rage and command. He missed his mother. The thought was so jarringly human, so at odds with the terrifying image of the vicious Lycan King, that it momentarily stunned me. He placed the candelabra back down, his gaze distant. Then, as if shaking himself from the memory, his focus sharpened again, landing back on me. You have seen this room tended properly, he stated. He wasn't praising me. He was acknowledging a fact. He tapped the heavy book he still held. Return to your duties. But tomorrow evening, after the kitchens are closed, you will come to the library. Elspeth will show you the way. Bring your knowledge of disrespectful honesty. Before I could react or question, he turned and strode back into the library, pulling the door quietly shut, leaving me alone once more, reeling from the encounter and the impossible summons. The king wanted to see me again, willingly.
Chapter 9. The next day in the kitchens was a fresh kind of torment. News of the king summoning me to the library had spread like wildfire. The other servants treated me with a mixture of fear and barely concealed resentment. They gave me a wide berth, their eyes suspicious. Had this stray somehow bewitched the king, or was she merely walking toward a more elaborate, delayed punishment? Grohl, the overseer, was particularly hostile, assigning me the foulest, most back-breaking tasks, clearly furious that I had somehow escaped his wrath the night before and gained the king's notice. I moved through the day in a fog of anxiety and bewildered anticipation. Why did he want to see me? What did he mean by bring your knowledge of disrespectful honesty? Was it a test, a trap, or simple curiosity? My mind conjured a dozen terrifying scenarios, each ending with me being thrown back into a cage or worse. Yet beneath the fear, a tiny, treacherous spark of curiosity flickered. He hadn't hurt me. He had listened. He had even shown a flicker of melancholy. It was confusing. As the evening meal service concluded and the kitchens began to quiet down, Elspeth, the stern head housekeeper, appeared at the scullery door. Her face was as impassive as ever, but her eyes held a keen, assessing light as she looked me over. "The king awaits you in the library," she said, her voice crisp and neutral. "Follow me, and try not to disgrace yourself further." My heart leapt into my throat. It was real. He hadn't changed his mind. Elspeth led me through corridors far grander than the service passages I was used to. Tapestries depicting savage hunts and ancient battles lined the walls. The air here was cleaner, quieter, imbued with a sense of ancient power. We arrived before a set of massive, ornately carved wooden doors. Elspeth pushed them open, revealing a room that stole my breath. The library was immense, a cathedral dedicated to knowledge. Towering shelves crammed with thousands upon thousands of books soared 2 stories high, encircling a vast, open space. Rolling ladders leaned against the shelves, disappearing into the shadowed upper reaches. A large fireplace crackled at one end, casting a warm glow on comfortable leather armchairs and polished wooden tables. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and smoke. And in the center of it all, seated in one of the large armchairs, with a heavy book open in his lap, was King Theron. He looked up as I entered, his icy blue eyes finding mine instantly.
Chapter 10. I stood frozen just inside the doorway, overwhelmed by the sheer scale and quiet grandeur of the library. It felt like holy ground, a place far removed from the grime and noise of the kitchens. Compared to the vastness of the room, King Theron looked less like a terrifying monarch and more like a solitary scholar, lost in a world of words. But the moment his icy blue eyes met mine, the familiar jolt of fear returned. He was still the Alpha King, and I was still the human servant who kept breaking the rules. "Leave us," Theron commanded, his voice quiet, but carrying easily across the vast space. Elspeth gave a curt bow and retreated, pulling the massive doors shut behind her with a soft, heavy thud. The sound echoed the sudden, frantic beating of my heart. We were alone. Utterly alone, in the heart of the king's private domain. He marked his page and closed the heavy book, placing it carefully on a small table beside his chair. He didn't rise. He simply watched me, his expression unreadable, letting the silence stretch. It was a power play, I realized. He was waiting for me to react, to show fear, to submit. I forced myself to stand straighter, to keep my gaze level, remembering his strange reaction the night before. Honesty. Respect. "You wish to see me, Your Majesty?" I finally asked, my voice barely a tremor in the quiet. "I did," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He gestured towards the chair opposite his, near the warmth of the fire. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Hesitantly, I walked across the plush rug, feeling ridiculously small and out of place, and perched on the very edge of the indicated armchair. It swallowed me whole. He watched my nervous movements, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You find my court difficult," he stated, leaning back in his own chair, steepling fingers beneath his chin. Was that a question? An accusation? "It is different, Your Majesty," I answered carefully. "The rules are not what I am used to." "Ah, yes," he murmured, his gaze intense. "The unrespectful honesty of looking a man in the eye." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "An alpha commands respect through presence, through power. The eyes are averted as acknowledgement of that power. To meet the alpha's gaze unprepared is to challenge that dominance, a potentially fatal error." He was explaining the law I kept breaking, but he wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, he was teaching me. "Then why?" he continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping lower, laced with genuine curiosity. "Why do you keep doing it?"
Chapter 11. His question hung in the quiet library, demanding an answer I didn't truly have. Why did I keep looking at him? The first time, in the Great Hall, was pure accident born of panic. The second time, in the sitting room, was a strange mix of fear and defiance. And now it felt different. Less like a mistake, more like an involuntary reaction, a need to gauge the true intent behind his icy blue eyes. "I don't know, Your Majesty," I answered honestly, my gaze dropping briefly before I forced myself to meet his stare again. Old habits died hard. It's a reflex, I suppose. Where I come from, you look at someone when they speak to you. It shows you're listening, that you're present. I fumbled for the right words, trying to explain a simple human interaction that felt incredibly complicated under his intense scrutiny. Looking away feels like hiding something. Theron leaned back in his chair again, considering my words. A faint frown creased his brow. So, directness equals honesty, he mused, echoing my earlier sentiment, and avoidance equals deceit. A simplistic view. Deceit can wear a direct gaze just as easily as honesty can hide behind averted eyes. He sounded like a scholar dissecting a flawed theory. Perhaps, I conceded softly, but it's the custom I learned. He was silent for a moment, his gaze sweeping over me, lingering on my worn servant's clothes, the faint smudge of soot I hadn't managed to scrub off my cheek from the kitchen fires. "Tell me another custom of your people," he commanded, his curiosity piqued. "Something illogical." I blinked, surprised by the request. What did humans do that a Lycan King would find illogical? We keep animals," I offered hesitantly. "Smaller ones. Cats, dogs. Not for work or food, just for company. We'd talk to them, let them sleep in our houses." His frown deepened. Inefficient creatures? Allowed inside dwellings for company? He shook his head slightly, as if the very idea was profoundly wasteful and bizarre. Lycan pups offer companionship and grow to serve the pack. Why nurture a creature with no function? "They offer comfort," I tried to explain. "Affection. Loyalty without expecting anything in return. Sometimes that's function enough." He fell silent again, but his gaze was different now. It was less analytical, more thoughtful. He looked at me, the human stray, the creature with illogical customs and disrespectful eyes, and for a fleeting second, I saw not a king judging a servant, but a profoundly lonely man considering the alien concept of uncomplicated affection. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire, and the vast, intimidating library suddenly felt a little less cold.
Chapter 12. The crackling fire filled the silence as Theron contemplated the idea of pets, of affection given freely without expectation of service. It was a concept so alien to the rigid, pragmatic hierarchy of Lycan society, especially his own harsh court, that it seemed to genuinely puzzle him. He looked at me, his icy blue eyes holding a thoughtful, almost distant expression, as if trying to reconcile this illogical human custom with his own understanding of the world. "Loyalty without expectation," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "A rare sentiment. In my experience, loyalty is always transactional, given in exchange for protection, for status, for survival." He gestured vaguely at the opulent library around us. "Even this," he said, a note of weariness entering his voice, "is a transaction. Knowledge for power. Power for control." His cynicism was a cold, hard thing, a shield forged by years of ruling a court likely filled with ambitious schemers and fair-weather allies. It made the brief glimpse of melancholy I'd seen earlier make more sense. He was utterly alone, even surrounded by his pack. "Maybe," I ventured softly, emboldened by the strange intimacy of the moment, "it doesn't always have to be?" He looked back at me sharply, the king returning, his gaze searching mine for hidden meaning. "An optimistic viewpoint, human, born perhaps of naivete. Or perhaps just hope," I countered quietly, holding his gaze despite the tremor of fear his intensity always sparked. "Hope that, even in a harsh world, there's room for something gentler." He didn't reply immediately. He simply stared at me, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the sharp planes of his face. I saw the internal conflict in his eyes, the ingrained cynicism warring with a flicker of something else, something that wanted to believe my naive human perspective might hold a kernel of truth. Hope, he said, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. Hope is a dangerous luxury, easily crushed. He rose from his chair, the movement fluid and decisive, signaling the end of our strange conversation. The brief moment of connection was over. He was the Jing again, and I was the servant. You have illuminated such an aspects of human irrationality, he stated, his tone once again cool and distant. Return to your duties. Elspeth will escort you. He turned away, picking up his book as if dismissing me from his thoughts entirely. Disappointment, sharp and unexpected, pricked at me. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that we had reached some kind of understanding. But the walls around his heart were ancient and thick. As I followed Elspeth back through the silent grand corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that, while I might have momentarily intrigued the king, truly reaching the man buried beneath the ice would be an impossible task.
Chapter 13. I returned to the kitchens feeling strangely adrift. The conversation with the king had been bewildering. One moment I felt a flicker of connection, a glimpse of the lonely man behind the icy facade. The next, he had dismissed me, as if I were nothing more than an amusing, irrational specimen. The whiplash was unsettling. Had I imagined the brief thaw? Was I just projecting human emotions onto a creature incapable of them? The kitchen staff treated me with the same weary distance as before. My strange summons to the library had only deepened their suspicion. Growl glared at me constantly, clearly waiting for me to make another mistake, any excuse to finally enact the punishment he felt I deserved. I focused on my work, scrubbing and hauling, trying to lose myself in the mindless rhythm of the tasks. But my thoughts kept returning to Theron, to his surprising curiosity about human customs, to the hint of sadness when he spoke of his mother. A few days passed in this uneasy state. I didn't see the king again. I told myself it was for the best. He was dangerous, unpredictable. My survival depended on remaining invisible, not engaging in philosophical debates about pets and honesty in his private library. Yet a part of me felt a strange sense of disappointment, a missed connection. One afternoon, while I was sorting through sacks of winter vegetables in the cold pantry, a commotion erupted just outside the kitchen doors. Shouts, snarls, and the unmistakable sound of a physical struggle echoed down the corridor. My first instinct was to hide, to make myself small. But then I heard a voice, sharp with pain and fear, that sounded familiar. It was the young Omega boy I had defended from Growl weeks ago. Against my better judgment, driven by the same stupid empathy that always seemed to get me into trouble, I crept towards the pantry door and peeked through a crack. 2 burly kitchen guards were manhandling the Omega boy, dragging him towards the outer courtyard. He struggled weakly, his face pale with terror. "I didn't steal it, I swear." "Lion runt," one of the guards snarled, shoving him hard. "We found the missing silver ladle under your pallet. The king wants thieves dealt with swiftly." My blood ran cold. Stealing, especially from the king's stores, was a serious crime. The punishment was often brutal, involving public flogging or worse. But I knew this boy. He was skittish and weak, but he wasn't malicious, and he certainly wasn't stupid enough to hide a stolen item under his own bed. This felt wrong. It felt like a setup, and looking at the smug expression on Growl's face as he watched the scene unfold from the kitchen doorway, I had a sickening suspicion about who might have orchestrated it. Chapter 14. My hands clenched at my sides. Watching the terrified Omega boy being dragged away, falsely accused, ignited a familiar, helpless rage within me. It mirrored my own capture, my own powerlessness against stronger, crueler forces. I knew the consequences of interfering. Grohl's threat about cleaning kettles with my tongue echoed in my mind. Staying silent was the safe choice, the smart choice in this brutal court. Keep your head down, survive. That was the mantra I had been trying to live by. But the image of the boy's tear-streaked face, the stark terror in his eyes wouldn't leave me. He was innocent. I was almost certain of it. And Grohl, the likely architect of this cruelty, watched with smug satisfaction. Someone had to speak up. Someone had to challenge the injustice, even if it was futile, even if it was dangerous. Before I could fully process the recklessness of my decision, I pushed the pantry door open and stepped out into the corridor. "Wait," I called out, my voice surprisingly steady despite the frantic pounding of my heart. The guard stopped, turning to look at me with annoyed surprise. The Omega boy stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, terrified hope. Grohl's smug expression vanished, replaced with a look of pure, murderous fury. He clearly hadn't expected the human stray to dare interfere again. "What is the meaning of this, stray?" Grohl snarled, taking a menacing step towards me. "Get back to your work before I interrupted him, forcing myself to stand tall to meet Grohl's furious gaze directly. "He didn't take it. I saw who did." Silence fell. My accusation hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Grohl's face turned an even darker shade of purple. He knew I was lying. He knew he had likely planted the ladle. But to accuse the overseer directly, that was suicidal. "You dare?" Grohl hissed, his voice low and shaking with rage. "You dare accuse someone? A worthless human chattel like you?" He advanced on me, his massive hand raised to strike. I flinched instinctively, but held my ground. "I saw one of the senior kitchen staff near the Omega's pallet just before the ladle went missing. He looked shifty." I kept my eyes locked on Grohl's, letting him see the challenge, the accusation I couldn't voice directly. He stopped, his hand hovering midair. He was caught. To strike me now would look like guilt. To dismiss my claim outright might raise suspicion among the guards. He was trapped by my unexpected, illogical defiance. His eyes narrowed into slits, promising retribution, but for now his hands were tied. He glared at the guards. "Hold the Omega. We will investigate this claim."
Chapter 15. Grohl's eyes promised a slow and painful retribution, but for the moment, I had won. The guards hesitated, looking from their furious overseer to me, the strange human who had somehow halted the proceedings. The Omega boy stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and dawning, incredulous hope. He was still caught, but the immediate threat of punishment had been paused. Grohl, trapped by my accusation and the presence of the guards as witnesses, couldn't simply beat the Omega into a confession or dismiss my claim without looking guilty himself. "Fine," Grohl spat, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. He glared at the guards. "Take the runt back to the holding cell. And you?" He pointed a thick, trembling finger at me. "Get back to the scullery. Don't think for 1 second this is over, stray." I didn't wait for a second command. I turned and hurried back towards the relative safety of the kitchens, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My legs felt weak, shaky from the adrenaline. What had I just done? I had lied. I had challenged the kitchen overseer. I had painted a target squarely on my own back. It was foolish, reckless, and utterly contrary to my survival instincts. Yet, as I pushed through the kitchen doors, a strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in my chest alongside the fear. It felt like pride. I had seen an injustice, and instead of hiding, I had spoken up. I had used my wits, the only weapon I possessed, to shield someone weaker. It was a small act, likely with dire consequences for me later, but it felt right. It felt human. The atmosphere in the kitchen was thick with tension. The other servants avoided my gaze, their fear almost palpable. They knew I had crossed a dangerous line. I picked up a scrubbing brush and attacked a pile of dirty cauldrons, trying to channel my nervous energy into the work. My mind raced. Had I just made things worse for the Omega Boy? Had I doomed myself? Hours passed. The evening meal was served and cleared. The kitchens began to quiet down. Grohl stalked through the room, his eyes burning holes into my back, but he didn't approach me. He was waiting for the right moment, perhaps when there were fewer witnesses. The suspense was agonizing. Finally, just as I was finishing the last of the pots, Elspeth appeared at the doorway again. My stomach plummeted. Was this it? Was she here to deliver my punishment? But her expression was, as always, unreadable. The king requires your presence. Again. In the library. Now.
Chapter 16. My blood ran cold. Summoned again? So soon? This couldn't be a coincidence. Growl must have gone straight to the king, reporting my insubordination. My brief flicker of pride guttered out, replaced by a chilling certainty that I had finally sealed my fate. Elspeth led me through the now familiar grand corridors, her silence more ominous than any scolding. Every step felt heavier than the last, a slow march towards an unknown punishment. Would he roar this time? Would he hand me over to Growl for a brutal lesson? We reached the massive library doors. Elspeth pushed them open and gestured for me to enter, her expression as unreadable as ever. I stepped inside, my heart pounding a heavy, slow drum against my ribs. The library was just as I remembered it, vast, silent, filled with the scent of old paper and the soft crackle of the fire. King Theron sat in the same large armchair, a heavy book open in his lap, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his scarred, handsome face. He looked up as I entered, his icy blue eyes meeting mine instantly. I forced myself not to look away this time, though the effort made my palms sweat. His expression was impossible to decipher. Was it anger, annoyance, cold indifference? He simply watched me as I walked hesitantly towards the center of the room and stopped, waiting for his judgment. "You caused quite a stir in the kitchens today, I hear," he said finally, his voice a low, calm rumble that held no obvious anger. He closed his book, marking his page. "Your Majesty?" I began, my voice trembling slightly despite my resolve. "I only meant to—" "You accused a senior staff member of theft. A lie, I presume?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "And you interfered with the lawful punishment of an Omega, another breach of pack protocol." "He was innocent," I whispered, unable to stop the words. "Growl, the overseer, he set the boy up. I saw it in his eyes." Theron tilted his head, a flicker of that unnerving curiosity returning. "You saw it in his eyes. You judged this situation based on empathy, and you acted against orders, against protocol, against your own self-interest." He rose slowly from his chair, a towering figure of barely contained power. He walked towards me, stopping just a few feet away. Most in my court would call that foolishness, suicidal foolishness. He paused, his gaze intense. I find myself calling it unexpectedly bold.
His words, unexpectedly bold, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the punishment I had anticipated. I stared at him, bewildered. Bold or incredibly stupid? I still wasn't sure. King Theron continued to study me, his icy blue eyes holding a strange analytical light. It felt less like a king judging a servant and more like a predator examining a curious new creature that had wandered into its territory, one that didn't behave according to the established rules. Grawl is a brute, Theron stated, his voice flat. Useful for maintaining order through fear, but lacking in finesse. He likely did plant the evidence against the Omega. It is his way. He spoke of his overseer's cruelty with a chilling detachment, as if discussing the weather. This casual acceptance of injustice sent a shiver down my spine. Yet his next words surprised me even more. However, your method of intervention, while irregular, achieved a temporary stay. You used a lie to counter a suspected injustice. You created doubt where there was none. It was strategic. He seemed almost impressed, in a cold, analytical way. He wasn't praising my empathy, he was acknowledging my cunning. It was a bizarre, unsettling compliment. He walked slowly around me, circling like a wolf assessing its prey, his gaze never leaving my face. "Tell me, Eliza," he said, using my name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice was startlingly intimate. "Are you truly foolish, or are you simply unafraid?" My heart hammered against my ribs. How could I answer that? I was terrified. Every moment in his presence was a tightrope walk over a chasm of potential violence. Yet, was I truly afraid of him? Or just of the power he represented, the brutal world he ruled? Looking into his icy blue eyes, searching past the king and the beast, I saw that flicker of loneliness again, the hint of a weary soul trapped behind the walls of his own making. Perhaps I am just too tired to learn another way to be.
Chapter 18. My honest admission, born of pure exhaustion rather than bravery, seemed to wrong-foot the king completely. He stared at me, the analytical curiosity in his icy blue eyes softening into something unreadable. "Too tired," he repeated softly, the words a quiet echo in the vast library. He looked me over again, truly seeing, perhaps for the first time, the faint shadows under my eyes, the weary slump of my shoulders that no amount of forced posture could fully hide. He saw not defiance, but the deep, bone-deep weariness of a soul that had endured too much. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He had expected fear, submission, perhaps even cunning. He had not expected this raw, quiet vulnerability. It resonated with the profound exhaustion that clung to his own ancient soul, the weariness of centuries spent controlling a beast within and a kingdom without. In my simple statement, he saw an unwelcome reflection of his own burden. He turned away abruptly, breaking the intense connection, and walked towards the massive fireplace. He rested one hand on the stone mantelpiece, staring down into the dancing flames, his back to me. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. I remained frozen, unsure if I had just made another terrible mistake, bearing my soul to a predator. Survival demands adaptation. Weakness is discarded. Emotion is a liability. That is the law of the North, the law I have upheld. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding me in the reflection of a nearby shadowed window pane. Yet you defy these laws simply by existing. You show empathy where there should be fear. You speak truth where there should be cunning. You reveal weariness where there should be a mask of strength. He faced me fully then, his expression a complex mixture of frustration and something else, something dangerously close to fascination. "It is illogical. Yet you stand." He took a step towards me. "Gruul will seek retribution for your interference. He cannot challenge my word directly, but he will find ways to make your life harder, more painful." He was stating a fact, a cold reality of the court I inhabited. I know. No, he countered, his voice dropping, becoming almost possessive. You will not endure it. He stopped before me, his presence once again overwhelming. Your duties in the kitchens are concluded, effective immediately. My eyes widened in shock. Was he dismissing me? Sending me away? Your new duties, he continued, his gaze intense, will be here, in the library, assisting me with the organization and translation of these archives. He was pulling me from the brutal anonymity of the kitchens into the very center of his world, under his direct, constant supervision. It wasn't a punishment. It was a claim.
Chapter 19. The king's decree echoed in the vast library long after he had uttered it. Your new duties will be here. I stared at him, stunned into silence, pulled from the brutal, exhausting reality of the kitchens and placed here? In this quiet sanctuary of knowledge, directly under his supervision? It felt less like a promotion and more like being moved from a dungeon cell to the king's private chambers. Safer in some ways, infinitely more dangerous in others. Grohl's physical threats were replaced by the constant, unnerving proximity of the Alpha King himself. Theron seemed to take my stunned silence as acceptance. Elspeth will arrange for your belongings, such as they are, to be moved to a servant's quarter nearer the library, he stated, his tone once again coolly efficient. You will report here each morning after the household's first meal. He turned back toward his armchair, clearly considering the matter settled, the conversation concluded. But my mind was reeling. Your Majesty, I began, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Forgive me, but why? I am not a scholar. I polish silver, I scrub floors. What use could I possibly be in a library? My confusion was genuine. This made no sense. He had countless pack members, likely far more educated than I, who could assist him. He paused, his back still to me, and looked over his shoulder. A flicker of something, impatience, amusement, crossed his features. You are literate, he stated, simply, as if that explained everything. You can read the old tongue, a skill most of my scholars lack. And, he added, his voice dropping slightly, you possess a unique perspective that I find less tedious than that of my usual sycophants. He was admitting, in his own cold way, that he found my blunt, human honesty refreshing, perhaps even valuable. As for your duties, he continued, turning fully to face me again, you will begin by organizing the archives in the West Wing. They have fallen into disarray. A simple, quiet task, suitable for someone resistant to lessons in submission. Was that a hint of humor in his voice? It was impossible to tell. His expression remained a mask of regal indifference. He gestured dismissively towards the door. Go. Rest. Your new duties begin tomorrow. I curtsied clumsily, my mind still trying to process the sudden seismic shift in my existence. I backed out of the library, Elspeth appearing silently in the corridor to escort me. As the massive doors closed behind me, cutting off the sight of the king already lost in his book once more, I felt a dizzying mix of relief and profound unease. I had escaped Grohl's immediate wrath. I had been pulled from the drudgery of the kitchens, but I had also been drawn deeper into the orbit of the vicious Lycan King, bound to him not just by circumstance, but now by royal decree. My cage had just become significantly smaller and infinitely more complicated.
Chapter 20. My first morning reporting to the library felt surreal. Instead of the chaotic, greasy heat of the kitchens, I was met with cool, quiet air that smelled of ancient paper and beeswax. Elspeth led me to the designated West Wing, a slightly dustier, less organized section filled with towering stacks of scrolls, loose manuscripts, and precariously piled books. "The king expects order," she stated, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged space. "Begin here. Do not disturb him unless absolutely necessary." With that, she left me alone in the silent, intimidating ocean of forgotten knowledge. For a moment, I was overwhelmed. The sheer volume of material was staggering. Where did one even begin? But then, a strange sense of calm settled over me. This was manageable. Unlike the unpredictable brutality of the kitchens, this task had logic, structure. It required patience and care, skills I possessed. I rolled up the sleeves of the simple, clean tunic Elspeth had provided, a vast improvement over my scullery rags, and started with the nearest stack. Hours passed in quiet, focused work. I carefully sorted scrolls by age and subject, deciphered faded scripts, and gently dusted brittle pages. It was meticulous, demanding work, but strangely satisfying. My mind, usually consumed by fear and anxiety, was engaged, finding a quiet rhythm in the task. I felt less like a servant and more like a scholar, albeit a very junior, unqualified one. Late in the afternoon, I was perched precariously on a rolling ladder, trying to decipher the title on a high shelf, when his voice startled me. "Finding anything of interest human." I nearly jumped, fumbling the scroll I held. I looked down to see King Theron standing at the foot of the ladder, watching me with those unnervingly intense, icy blue eyes. He had moved with absolute silence. So much for the no sudden appearances rule I hadn't actually had the courage to voice. "Your Majesty," I stammered, clutching the scroll to my chest. "Just sorting as you ordered." He didn't reply immediately. His gaze drifted over the progress I had made, the neat piles of scrolls, the organized stacks of manuscripts. It wasn't much, given the sheer volume, but it was a start. An island of order in the chaos. A flicker of something. Approval crossed his features. "You are methodical," he observed. He stepped closer, looking up at the scroll I held. "What is that?" "It appears to be a treatise on lunar herbology, Your Majesty. It was written in the old tongue." His eyes sharpened with interest. "Indeed. And can you make sense of it?" He wasn't testing me. Not exactly. It felt more like genuine curiosity again, the scholar peeking out from behind the king. The invitation hung in the air, an offer to share, to connect over the dusty pages of a forgotten text.
Chapter 21. I hesitated for only a second. This felt like another test, a chance to prove my worth beyond scrubbing floors. Carefully, I descended the ladder, clutching the ancient scroll. I unrolled it gently on a nearby table cleared of dust, the brittle parchment crackling softly. "It speaks of herbs that bloom only under specific moon phases," I explained, pointing to the elegant, faded script. "Their properties change depending on the light. This section describes the moonglow moss, said to soothe fevers and mend bone when harvested under a waxing crescent." Theron leaned closer, his usual imposing presence softened by genuine interest. His icy blue eyes scanned the old tongue script, then flickered to the detailed botanical drawings beside it. Moonglow moss. My pack healers lost the knowledge of its proper harvesting generations ago. They deemed it too unpredictable. He looked at me, a spark of something sharp and keen in his gaze. "But this text details the exact lunar timing."
Yes, Your Majesty, and the proper drying method to preserve its potency. It says the key is not just the moonlight, but the dew collected on the leaves before sunrise. He stared at the scroll, then back at me, a slow, dawning realization spreading across his features. He wasn't just seeing a literate servant, he was seeing a potential key to reclaiming lost knowledge, lost power for his pack. My useless human skills, the knowledge passed down by my mother, held unexpected value in his world. You have a healer's knowledge, he stated, his voice quiet, almost wondering. My mother was a village healer. She'd taught me what she knew. And you remember it all, he mused, his gaze sweeping over the countless books surrounding us. He looked back at me, and the distance between king and servant seemed to vanish entirely in that moment. This library holds the accumulation of knowledge of 1,000 years, he said. Histories, battle strategies, forgotten magic. But knowledge is useless without someone who can read it, understand it, apply it. He paused, his eyes holding mine. Perhaps your presence here is not merely illogical after all. His words, the quiet implication of purpose, of value, sent a warm flutter through my chest. He wasn't just intrigued anymore. He was beginning to see me as an asset, perhaps even an ally. The shift was subtle but profound. As he leaned closer to examine the scroll again, his shoulder brushing lightly against mine, the accidental contact no longer felt like a terrifying breach of protocol, but the tentative beginning of a fragile, dangerous partnership.
Chapter 22. The shared discovery of the lunar herbology text became a turning point. Theron no longer left me to toil alone in the dusty archives. He started spending hours in the library himself, sometimes reading silently in his armchair while I worked, other times bringing specific scrolls or books to me, asking for translations or interpretations. Our interactions took on the rhythm of colleagues, albeit one separated by an immense gulf of power and species. He was a demanding student, his mind sharp and analytical, absorbing the ancient knowledge with a fierce intensity. But he was also surprisingly patient, listening intently as I deciphered complex passages or explained the nuances of forgotten healing practices. He learned about poultices for shifter-specific wounds, about herbs that could soothe the transition during a difficult moon, about remedies lost to his pack's more aggressive martial focus. In turn, I learned more about him, glimpses of the king behind the vicious reputation. I saw his frustration with the gaps in his people's history, his quiet determination to reclaim the knowledge lost through generations of war and neglect. I saw the weight of his responsibilities in the lines of exhaustion that sometimes appeared around his eyes late at night. And occasionally, I saw a flicker of dry, unexpected humor when I stumbled over a particularly archaic phrase or offered a modern, human perspective on an ancient Lycan dilemma. One evening, while translating a particularly dense passage about warding spells, I grew frustrated. "This script is deliberately obtuse," I complained, rubbing my temples. "It's like the author didn't want anyone to actually understand it." Theron looked up from the map he was studying. A genuine, fleeting smile touched his lips. "That was likely the point. Old magic was guarded jealously. Knowledge was power, hoarded rather than shared." His smile faded, replaced by a more somber expression. "My ancestors believed strength lay in dominance, in secrets. They forgot that true strength often lies in connection, in shared understanding." He rose and walked over to the table where I worked. He looked down at the complex, swirling script of the warding spell. "This magic," he murmured, his voice low, "it requires balance, intent, not just raw power." He looked at me, his icy blue eyes holding a strange, speculative light, like the empathy you showed in the kitchens, like the honesty you offered about meeting my gaze. He was connecting my simple human traits to the ancient forgotten magic described in the book. He was seeing a pattern, a potential link between my illogical nature and the very power his people had lost. The intensity of his gaze made my breath catch, the air in the library suddenly charged with a new, dangerous possibility. Chapter 23. The library became our shared world, a quiet bubble within the cold, tense fortress. Theron seemed to shed some of his harsh, kingly persona whenever he entered, becoming more the scholar, the historian, driven by a thirst for the knowledge his people had let slip away. Our days settled into a comfortable rhythm, quiet hours spent translating ancient texts, punctuated by discussions that ranged from forgotten healing arts to the complex politics of long-dead shifter kingdoms. He treated me less like a servant and more like a colleague, an incredibly unequal colleague, granted, but the respect was genuine and startling. One afternoon, he was wrestling with a particularly complex territorial dispute described in an old chronicle. Two minor packs had nearly wiped each other out over a seemingly barren stretch of land generations ago. "It makes no sense," Theron growled, scowling at the faded map accompanying the text. "The land had no strategic value, no resources worth mentioning. Why such bloodshed over rock and ice?" He saw it purely through the lens of Lycan dominance and resource acquisition. I leaned over the map, tracing the faint lines indicating old migration routes. "Maybe it wasn't about resources," I suggested hesitantly. "The Chronicle mentions it was a sacred birthing ground for the snow hares. Maybe the packs weren't fighting over ownership, but over stewardship, protecting something they both held sacred but couldn't agree on how?" Theron steered at the map, then at me, his blue eyes wide with a dawning comprehension. He had been looking for a motive rooted in power and greed. The idea of a conflict born from reverence, from a desire to protect something fragile, was a completely alien concept within his understanding of pack warfare. "Stewardship," he repeated softly, testing the word. He looked back at the Chronicle, reading the passage again with fresh eyes. "By the ancients," he breathed. "It fits. All this time, my scholars assumed resources, but it was faith." He looked at me again, and the admiration in his gaze was now mixed with something deeper, something unsettlingly intense. "You see patterns others miss, Eliza. You see the heart beneath the conflict." He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine as we both pointed to the same spot on the map. The accidental contact sent a jolt, sharp and warm through me. I snatched my hand back as if burned, my cheeks flushing. He let his hand linger for a second longer, his gaze holding mine, a silent acknowledgement of the spark that had just passed between us. The air grew thick. The quiet library suddenly charged with an energy that had nothing to do with ancient texts.
Chapter 24. The charged silence stretched after our hands brushed, thick with unspoken awareness. I quickly busied myself rolling up the Chronicle, needing to put a physical distance between us, needing to break the sudden, intense connection that had flared. Theron watched me, his expression unreadable, but the icy reserve in his eyes had been replaced by a low, simmering fire. He was no longer just seeing a useful translator or an interesting anomaly. He was seeing me, Eliza, the human woman, and the recognition held a dangerous magnetic pull. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet library. "You have," he began, his voice slightly rougher than usual, "a unique way of interpreting history, less predatory than my own. Perhaps just less immediately suspicious," I replied, attempting a light tone that didn't quite land. I kept my focus on the scroll, avoiding his gaze. Looking at him directly now felt even more perilous than before. "Suspicion is a necessary tool for survival in my world," he countered.
though without his usual cold conviction. Trust is a luxury rarely afforded. He paused, and yet. I risked a glance at him. He was watching me intently, his head tilted slightly, a frown creasing his brow as if wrestling with a complex internal conflict. And yet, he continued softly, you offer insights born of empathy, of hope, illogical sentiments, yet they yield results my strategists miss. He was grappling with the paradox I represented. My human weaknesses were proving to be unexpected strengths. He took a step closer, invading my carefully constructed space once more. I could smell the faint, clean scent of the cold northern air that always clung to him, mixed with the old paper of the library. Perhaps, he mused, his voice dropping to a low murmur that sent shivers down my spine, perhaps there is a power in this gentler perspective that my people have forgotten. He reached out, not to touch me, but to rest his hand on the table beside the scroll I held, effectively trapping me in place. His proximity was overwhelming. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the vicious Lycan King, a creature of legend, scarred and brutal, but the look in his eyes held no threat, only a raw, bewildered fascination and a dawning, dangerous desire. He was close enough that I could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the subtle shift of muscle beneath his skin. He was terrifyingly real, terrifyingly close. Teach me more, he whispered, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. Teach me this illogical human way of seeing the world. The request was laden with a meaning far deeper than simple academic curiosity.
Chapter 25. His whispered request, teach me this illogical human way, hung between us, heavy with unspoken invitation. The air in the library crackled, the silence no longer just quiet, but charged with the potent energy shifting between the scarred Lycan King and the human servant who had somehow breached his icy defenses. My breath caught in my throat. This was dangerous territory, far beyond translating ancient texts. He wasn't just asking about history anymore. He was asking about me, about the different world reflected in my eyes. I don't know if I can teach it, Your Majesty, I stammered, my gaze dropping briefly to his hand resting near mine on the table. It's not a skill like reading. It's just feeling. Feeling, he repeated, the word a low rumble, laced with a mixture of curiosity and something akin to frustration. Another illogical human concept. Feelings are weaknesses. They cloud judgment. They invite betrayal. His gaze flickered, a shadow of old pain passing through his icy blue eyes, likely remembering the betrayal that had scarred him body and soul. Maybe, I countered softly, finding a sliver of courage. Maybe they're just information, a different kind of knowledge. Knowing why those packs fought over the snow hare grounds, that's useful, isn't it? Even if the reason was faith, not power. He considered this, his brow furrowed. He hadn't thought of it that way. Emotion as data. It was a perspective that appealed to his strategic mind while still acknowledging the alien concept I've represented. A slow, almost reluctant smile touched his lips. Perhaps you have a point, Eliza. Perhaps there is efficiency in understanding these illogical human motivations. He leaned closer, the predatory intensity returning to his gaze, but softened now with genuine fascination. Show me, he murmured, his voice dropping again, becoming dangerously intimate. Show me how you see. When you look at me, what illogical ceilings do you perceive? The question was a direct challenge, a demand for the disrespectful honesty he claimed to value. My heart hammered. Could I dare? Could I tell him that beneath the terrifying king, I saw a profound loneliness? That beneath the scars, I sensed a deep, aching vulnerability? That his icy control felt less like strength and more like a desperate shield against a pain I couldn't comprehend? I met his gaze directly, the old fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of empathy so strong it was almost painful. I see someone, I began, my voice barely a whisper, who is tired of being only a king. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. My words struck home, hitting a truth he had likely never admitted, even to himself. He didn't roar. He didn't pull away. Instead, he simply stared at me, stripped bare by my quiet observation. And then, slowly, deliberately, he closed the last inch of space between us and captured my lips with his own.